So everywhere there is both salmon farms and wild salmon. The farm salmon escapes. Some of them find their way up into the spawning grounds of the wild salmon, and they leave offspring in the wild. So on the left-hand side here, you see an example of this after a major escape event in southern Newfoundland, where the sample juvenile salmon were dominated by farm salmon hybrids, which is shown in the light red color. So in Norway, we have a substantial amount of salmon farming, and the situation is quite bad. So this is a survey from 2020, where they checked 239 rivers, and in only 1/3 of those, they found no effects of introgression of wild salmon. So in almost as many, in 29% of the population, they saw large genetic changes, meaning that more than 10% of the genetic material in the river come from farm strains, and which is shown in the red. So the ones that are unaffected are shown in the green, and the ones that are most affected are shown in the red. The yellow and orange dots are in between these two extremes, so between no and 10% farm genetic introgression. And since aquaculture is increasing worldwide, the worry is, of course, that in not too long, the situations in several parts of the North Atlantic will be as bad as in Norway. So, what consequences do we expect from this extensive gene flow? So from an evolutionary theory point of view, there is no doubt that the offspring between a domesticated organism and its wild conspecific will have reduced survival and/or reproduction in the wild. So we don't really need to do any experiments to know that extensive farm salmon integration is harmful for the wild salmon populations. But we do have a lot of solid empirical evidence. We have 3 large-scale experiments of controlled releases. So one in Bury Shoal, which was led by Phil McGinnity, which is in the audience here. One in the River Imsa, which was led by Ian Fleming, which is also present here. And then we have a last one in Guddalselva, which is also in Norway, as the Imsa was, which was a study by Øystein Skåla and his colleagues. And Skåla et al. Reports that the difference in survival probability from a genetically wild to a genetically farmed salmon is about 1/3. So the farm salmon has a 1/3 survival probability from eggs to adult compared to a wild salmon, and with the hybrids in between. So there is also a huge amount of experimental studies on other type of traits, and these were reviewed. Many of these were reviewed in this excellent study reviewed by Kevin Glovers and colleagues. And there you show differences in a lot of different traits, including molecular genetic polymorphism, growth, morphology, life history, behavior, physiology, and green transcription. So, is there really anything more we need to do? Where to go next? We really know that this is harmful. So from a management point of view, you should try to avoid this situation in the river. But we can add some footnotes to try to understand the process better. And one of the things that is lacking from the literature is studies on wild populations, where you try to see what has happened in a population that is affected by farm genetic introgression. And the other thing I want to advocate is a concept that is called pace of life. And we can try to use this to get a more general understanding of to understand the effect of genetic introgression. So this work builds on previous work by Huntington Ford back in 2004. It has long been recognized that the species differ demographically from having a fast life history, such as mice with a young age of reproduction, to having a slow life history, such as elephants and whales with a the late age of reproduction. And across this slow-fast continuum, there are systematic changes, not only in life history traits, which some of them are indicated here in the figure, but also in several behavioral and physiological traits. So the benefit of using this concept is that we can try to understand all the results in a common biological framework. And by this, we can maybe get a deeper understanding and better understanding of the ecological consequences of introgression. So this idea that many traits differ systematically across a slow to fast pace of life is often referred to as the pace of life syndrome hypothesis, or POLS hypothesis. So according to this hypothesis, the selection for faster growth in the farm strains selects also for a faster pace of life. But the major question is whether this also leads to a faster pace of life in the affected wild populations. So the critical prediction of this POLS hypothesis is that introgressed individuals in the wild will have a faster life cycle, meaning that they have an earlier age of reproduction. So we wanted to test this. And we had data on almost 7,000 individual adult Atlantic salmon captured in 105 Norwegian rivers. And these were fish that were all born in the wild, but they differed in their level of farmed introgression. That is their level of ancestry that comes from the farm breeding lines. And from each of these scale samples, we obtained the number of years they spent in freshwater, the number of years they spent at sea, and we can also get estimates of growth at different periods. And we can get DNA from the scales, and we have developed a molecular a genetic tool that can estimate the molecular farm genetic ancestry in each fish. And in addition, we had the length and mass and sex of each fish, which was recorded by the anglers. This is the result on the early life history. So along the x-axis here, 0 means a genetically wild fish, and 100% means a genetically farm fish. And then you have the hybrids in the middle. And each line is one of the 105 rivers, and the thick lines is the average across all the rivers. And this is the probability of smolting and migrating out to the ocean when you're 2 years of age. So in Norway, it's about a little over 20% probability in a wild Norwegian salmon. But when you increase the introgression, the probability almost doubled, or more than doubles actually, to about 50% probability. So if we use this and try to calculate what that has to say for the age of the fish when it outmigrates, it goes from about 2.8 years, which is the average in Norway, to about 2.5 for a fish that is 100% genetically farmed. So a difference of 0.34 years. This is the distribution of sea ages. So in yellow, it's the fraction of fish that is spent 3 years at sea or more. This is the 2-sea winters, and this is the 1-sea winters in females. So you can see that the number of 2-sea winter fish increases with level of genetic introgression. In males, it's a slight increase in number of 1-sea winter fish. We also saw that the growth at sea increased with farm genetic introgression. But interestingly, the really fast-growing wild populations, so these guys up here that grow naturally fast, they had a negative effect of introgression from the farmed fish. So even if they're selected for very high growth in aquaculture, they don't beat wild population that in its own environment, so in the wild. If you put the early and the late life history together and calculate what this has to say for the age at maturity of the fish. For females, we have a decline of 0.3 years in females, and in males there is a decline of 0.43 years from 0 to 100% farm genetic ancestry. And there's quite a big range among the rivers, but there is no one with a positive effect. So this may not sound a lot, but these are quite large biological changes. And in addition, it must be stressed here that the method we use to estimate farm genetic ancestry is molecular and contains uncertainty. And therefore, these estimates are conservative. They're really underestimating the real biological effect. So most likely, it's bigger effects than what I have told you here. The results of our analysis reveals that the farm genetic introgression leads to an earlier age at maturation, which is in accordance with this Bolstd hypothesis. In addition, the change age at maturity was more affected by early life, so it seems like the introgression affects the early life of salmon more than the late life of salmon. And we see an increasing growth both in the freshwater and at sea. And there are also previous experiments that support this Bolstd hypothesis. So farm compared to wild fish have shown to have faster growth and higher levels of aggression and boldness, increased dispersal, smaller egg size, down-regulated immune genes, and up-regulated protein synthesis and metabolism. So here I plotted where I put up a table that I adapted from a review of pace of life. So on the right-hand side of the table, you see traits that are typically associated with the fast pace of life, and on the left-hand side, you see traits that are typically associated with the slow pace of life. And I've highlighted here where we have experimental evidence for a change from farm to wild salmon. So you see that it ticks off a lot of these boxes. So at least for me, it seems quite clear that the farmed Atlantic salmon is genetically altered towards a faster pace of life, and that these changes will be inherited by its wild-born offspring. Okay, so what is the consequences for the wild salmon population? So first, we expect to see reduced productivity. So there is good empirical evidence for reduced survival in the wild, and genetic changes away from the optimal life history of the wild population is expected to reduce the fitness. In addition, faster pace of life is associated with more fluctuating population sizes, which again would reduce the long-term population growth rate and population viability. We also expect reduced resilience to future challenges. And the point here is that this one-way gene flow from farm escapees is expected to erode the genetic variation in adaptive traits in the wild. And this is probably a larger effect outside Norway than in Norway if the ancestry of the farm salmon is Norwegian, because you get the phylogenetic effect on top of the domestication effect from salmon farming. In addition, we expect to see some ecosystem effects because of faster pace of life and a higher metabolism. We would expect there to be a change in the foraging behavior and prey type, and this can have cascading effects in the river ecosystems. So, if you're interested more in this, you could read this paper that was published in 2001, and I also wrote about this in a NASCO report that was also published in 2021. And these are my colleagues and institutions and funding agencies. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.